Whether we realize it or not, there does tend to be a reoccurrence of bias in the news. At first, when this topic is brought up in conversation, automatically people tend to assume that the discussion is going to be focused basically just around politics and political bias. While political bias is a large part of news station broadcasting, it is not the only bias that is evident. There are many types of news bias throughout all of the different networks and stations that are broadcasted daily. So what are the types of bias that have become more and more common over the years in the news, and what sort of messages do they send to their audience? Political bias has been a heated topic of conversation as of recently, in particular, especially because of the upcoming presidential election. However, I have researched many forms of media bias over the past few weeks and have come to the realization that political news bias is only the tip of the iceberg. A few of the forms of news bias to be considered are repulsion, omission, and manipulation bias. I'll cover these few types of the biases and their relation to women in politics, racism, and the news station's attempt to manipulate viewers and readers with a political slant. With the upcoming election, media bias should be considered a very significant topic to Americans. It is important that all news viewers take the information that they are receiving from these situations with a grain of salt. After researching the topic of news bias extensively, it has come to my attention that media bias is more present now than ever before. There's a long history of bias in the news dating back to the 1800s when Victoria Woodhull ran to try to become the country's first female president. Racial stereotypes are also still at hand, even after the civil rights movement for equality among all Americans. I believe that it is our social responsibility to try and form our own opinions in order to stay away from the bias towards political preference, race, and gender. Women have become more involved in the political game, which has led to media outlets at times being biased towards their views simply because of gender. Women like Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin have become the victims of the bias reflected in cruel political reports regarding their appearance or family responsibilities, which are not attributed to men as often. There have been studies on the coverage of women while they're campaigning, which have all proven that there tends to be a slant favoring the men. It was shown that newspapers wrote fewer stories along with fewer words on each story on women in comparison to men. All the while, these campaigning women had had almost identical credentials as their opposing men. An average of these newspapers showed that men had 2 times as many articles written about them than women, all while being substantially larger than the women's articles. This is blatant news bias and has yet to be corrected over the past 8 campaigns that have involved women running for various public offices. Perhaps the largest disadvantage to women while they're campaigning for presidency is the use of offensive stereotypes. Western culture has become proven to associate masculine traits with leadership, which causes most people within our culture to associate our world leaders with being a man. During female candidate ads, they try to portray masculine traits 91% of the time to come off as more masculine and be looked at as more of a leader. The reason that they feel the need to do this is because of the news stations appear to be pushing the need for masculinity traits in our country's leader. Probably the most difficult stereotype of all that they have to come is the stereotype that they are irrational or emotionally unstable. During the campaign between Pat Schroeder and Richard Gephardt, there was an obvious instance of bias towards women in politics. During the campaign, newspapers used the emotional 11 times per 10,000 words when describing Schroeder, and those same papers never once described Richard Gephardt as being an emotional representative. Another example of bias in the news towards women occurred during Margaret Chase Smith's 1964 presidential campaign. A letter to the newspaper's editor stated that a man said, "Now that women are allowed of holding the highest office, it's bad enough that we allow them to operate automobiles." This is just a direct strike to women who aspire to be anything more than a stay-at-home mother. And implementing these stereotypes while speaking about women in order to damage their potential campaign is the most pure form of news bias. There are, however, more subtle forms of bias towards women as well. The news tends to emphasize the fact that the candidate at hand is a female and not a male. Whenever Margaret Chase Smith was asked a question pertaining to her plans in office, the interviewer would consistently ask as a prerequisite the phrase, "as a woman president." By employing these phraseology, it is clear that the news is conveying the message that the man and woman are not on equal terms. No interviewer has ever asked a male candidate as a man prior to his question. With the drastic changes in technologies and news coverage, there has to be a sense of equality portrayed through the media rather than leaning towards one side, either male or female. There has been evident news bias towards women from Victoria Woolhall in the 1800s to Sarah Palin in the 2008 elections. The only way for women to overcome the effects of the news bias is to consistently point out the hypocrisy in an attempt to basically shame the media into a fair and equal presentation. Another hot topic when it comes to bias in the news is racism. There's been racism in the media for decades, and though we may feel that we have conquered using negative stereotypes in the media, it could not be further from the truth. Negative stereotypes due to race, creed, ethnicity have become very widely known, mainly known starting in World War II when Nazi Germany would post negative stereotypes about Jewish residents. Also, in white violence, the way media portrays black violence is different than as white violence. White violence was always glorified in dime novels and immortalized the exploits of like Jesse James, and these representations all often made children aspire to be like them. Jesse James was viewed as a person that summed up a strong and fearless individual, which effectively wiped out the seriousness of white violence. Black violence has always been portrayed in the media as much more of a darker sense. It has always been looked at as cruel and malicious in nature. A good example of racism bias in the news took place when police were searching for a Caucasian male in his 20s to 30s that was shooting innocent bystanders with a sniper rifle. While reporting on the topic at hand, CNN anchors spoke of this person as a person who was very smart, cool, and collected. There was much speculation that the man did time as an important government military man and was most likely an elite type person. After an arrest was made, it was found out that the actual culprits were two African Americans. And once this was found out, the news stations changed that calm and collected person into two stupid or idiotic suspects. This demonstrates an example of how the race of the perpetrator can drive the content of the report in many ways as much as the actual report itself. With the white male, they believed that they could create some type of superhuman villain who was mystifying and going against the law because of some deep incident that happened in the military. But once it was found that the suspects were two black males, the news stations returned to their original stereotypes by calling the suspects stupid and unprepared. This is an example of manipulation bias in the media. Manipulation bias is defined as cynically writing or reporting in such a way to remove the news into one direction that will benefit the reporter. This tends to be the most common form of bias because stations try to gain the highest ratings. The best way to do this is to manipulate viewers into watching the channel by broadcasting information that may not be completely truthful. The most recent case of manipulation bias in the media is the George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin case. At the beginning of the case, news outlets put out pictures of the suspect Zimmerman in an orange jumpsuit from his previous incarceration, all while showing pictures of Trayvon Martin as a young boy. These pictures were outdated and conveyed the idea that Zimmerman shot a young boy without cause. The story made the news stations go crazy, and it was immediately blown into a huge story while no real facts of the event were shown or known, and it was just being spoon-fed to the public as a racial issue. Naturally, any case of violence is a tragedy. The problem with the implementation of the bias in the story is that when actual facts are colored by reports in order to sensationalize them for viewer attention, the truth of what actually happened becomes the victim of the media's bloodlust. If there was something that could be learned from such an event like the Trayvon Martin's death, it certainly is lost in the misconstruction of events which are fueled for ratings and for political gain. To me, it seems quite clear that bias of any kind, whether it be in race, culture, education, or politics, does not serve anybody a service. It creates a muddled and hazy picture to the information-seeking public. The reason for biased reporting is to lead presumed naive and uninformed viewers down an imaginary path in order to attain a desired outcome. It is an attempt to present information with a twist in the delivery so that true nature of the event is buried. With these facts in mind, it would serve us all well to absorb information through a filter and to train our minds to see through the haze of media. My own theory leads me to believe that more knowledgeable that we can become towards media bias, the more that we can attempt to vote for fair media by only purchasing or viewing what we find suitable and fair. Eventually, the rags and reporters who sensationalize and confuse the truth will be marginalized and done away with, and we can come to trust, again, the purveyors of our world's events to be truthful and honest. Thank you.